The topic tonight, of course, is Russia and U.S.-Russia relations, and it's widely acknowledged on both sides that the relationship between the U.S. and Russia today has plumbed new depths, uncharted since the end of the Cold War about a quarter of a century ago. And this has led to a pretty robust debate, again on both sides, as to whether relations are so frigid as to constitute a second Cold War. With one group of wise folks on one side saying, no, the geopolitical map has changed since the latter part of the last century. Others equally convinced that the similarities are there and sufficient. There's no one I can think of better among those sage observers than Robert Legvold to discuss this question of are we in a new Cold War, especially since he has recently written a splendid new book called Return to Cold War. He is the Marshall D. Shulman Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. He had been director previously of the Harriman Institute at Columbia. He's also a director of the national project Meeting the Challenge of the New Nuclear Era of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge. But it seems when you began this book, and also in the Foreign Affairs article you wrote some time ago on the question, it seemed that you began with a degree of skepticism as to whether we had in fact reached the depths of a new Cold War. But I think you've concluded that the term Cold War, with all its historical heft and implications, is not hyperbole. Can you just briefly, why is that so?
Well, the first thing I would say is this book was a product of the publisher that had read that Foreign Affairs article and came and said, would you like to justify yourself with a book at this length? So that's why I did it. I had not planned to write this book as such. But in answering that question, because that article was written in the spring of 2014, about a month into the Ukrainian crisis, and then published in Foreign Affairs in the summer issue. So I paused for a moment. I said, what we've seen since Maidan in February and now the growing war in Donbass after the annexation of Crimea, is this likely to deepen? Is it likely to endure or not? And the life of a book would cover a period when I could look very wrong if not. But by the time I agreed to do it in the fall, I was persuaded that we're not only in a qualitatively different phase of U.S.-Russia relations from anything that we had seen in the post-Cold War period in the 1990s, and even through the first part of the Putin leadership, and it was likely to endure. And indeed, it was likely to deepen because other aspects of it would be added. So the question was, if it is qualitatively different, and I say this to audiences such as this that immediately push back and say, well, it's not a Cold War because it's not anything like the original Cold War. True, in fundamental respects it's not. But do you disagree that it's qualitatively different from where we were in the 90s? And if so, what's your conceptual framework for capturing that, for understanding it? Because only if you have some kind of a framework for understanding what has happened can you then sit down and say, okay, what are the consequences of what have happened? And only if you begin thinking about its consequences, what the stakes both have in the circumstances, can you begin thinking about whether it's worth doing something to change things, and if it is, what that might be, how you'd go about doing it. But you have to be able to justify the label of Cold War, even if, as I started, by saying it's qualitatively different. This Cold War between the United States and Russia, between Russia and the West, does not engulf or encompass the entire international system the way the original Cold War did. The original Cold War was the international system in a bipolar world. It's no longer driven by the same kind of basic ideological animus that represents competition between two economic and political systems as before. It's no longer, at least not to this point, under the shadow of nuclear Armageddon, which was fundamental to the original Cold War. But there are 5 characteristics that are very much like the original Cold War, and my justification for using that as a way of capturing what is qualitatively significant in this instance. And alas, those 5 characteristics were most prevalent in the earliest phases of the original Cold War, 1948 until Stalin's death and shortly after. I won't go through all 5 because we want to carry on with this, but to illustrate. In the first place, then and now, each side blames the other side almost 100% for what's gone wrong. There's no introspection. There's no sense of what's been the interaction over the 20 years. And it's not merely that we blame the other side 99% for what's happened. It's the reason that we blame the other side for it. It's not merely in their specific behavior, it's the reason for their behavior, and that is the nature of the system on the other side. It's Putinism in Russia, under Putin. And on their side, it's the nature of the American political system, not just the Obama administration. That was essentially the nature of the explanation 48 to 53 and beyond. Secondly, the assumption is that the problem is not merely a conflict of interest. Countries have conflicts of interest, and adversarial relations often have very serious conflicts of interest. But it's being driven by a conflict of purpose in each side. And that too was true 48 to 1952. And as a result, there's very little basis to hope or assume there's common ground that we can find between the two if what's driving it is not just conflict of interest that you could try to minimize or reconcile, but conflict of purpose. Third, the assumption then, it was at the heart of George Kennan's famous 47 pieces called The Sources of Soviet Conduct, the famous containment article. This situation won't change until something basic changes on the other side. The other side either comes apart or it changes in its fundamental nature. That was the premise of the containment doctrine that Kennan outlined then. Same thing is true now in the Obama administration, which has a milder version of this than the Congress or the media or much of the expert community. The assumption is it's not going to change soon. Nobody expects things to change in Russia anytime soon. And I can tell you, maybe with a partial exception of what may be some uncertain hopes around Donald Trump's candidacy, that the Russians don't expect anything to improve out of this presidential election. So lots of things that are like the original Cold War that explain why this is qualitatively significant.
One quick follow-up on that is why is the mood just so virulent and you might say downright personal? Even some who are not reflexively disposed favorably to President Putin have pointed out that the level of caricature of Putin in the Western media is really extraordinary. And in terms of actual policies, you said yourself at one point that never during the Cold War had the US and European allies attempted to blacklist and punish as many senior Russians. Given all that you've said, why is just the very atmosphere so poisonous?
I don't know. At one level, David, I get up in the morning. My job is to come to meetings like this or on occasion go into a classroom or write a piece and try to make sense of what makes no sense. The original Cold War had a fundamental logic to it. Maybe it need not have been as intense, exaggerated, as militarized, as universalized as it was, but there was a basic logic to the original Cold War. There's no good explanation for how, out of 20 years, given our hopes at the end of the Soviet Union, we are where we are. So the honest answer to your question is I don't know. The rather hapless attempt on my part to explain it, I think, does have bases, probably most particularly in the nature of the political struggles that each of us are going through domestically. We, from a superior position, I think they feel vulnerabilities at a slightly higher level. It also is a function of leadership and where leadership has chosen to go in these circumstances. I don't think Russia, to be frank, is well served by its current leadership. And I think that leadership, for whatever set of reasons, out of partly conviction, maybe that conviction comes from what is the background of many of these people, beginning with President Putin, but those that he surrounded himself with, key advisors, were part of an organization that thought in terms of a fundamental hostility from the West. It's been very easy for a recrudescence of those sentiments of the way you thought about the world before in these circumstances. There is also this tendency on the part of many Russians, whatever may be the level of hardship and poverty or difficulty, to assume that there is a kind of historic right for Russia to be treated with respect and to be treated as a great power. There is this Russian notion of державность. That's a noun. My good colleague Tim Fry from Columbia, a successor at Columbia, I think would agree with me. It's very hard to translate that into English in a way that makes sense. To translate it literally, it would mean great poweredness. and you're entitled to it whether you have the wherewithal or not. And it goes back to, when I did some work, to the 9th century. And each time of periods of vulnerability, such as Russia's going through, they come back to that kind of thing. In fact, it has practical implications. I think one of the successes in Putin's mind about what's going on in Syria is the fact that the United States and Russia are now the co-chairs of the diplomacy that has to make this work. Russia's back in a way that matters globally. And that's certainly true in sort of the visceral, emotional, often puerile way in which he expresses this notion, treat us as a major power. But that would be too trivial a way to explain why things have gone as badly as they have. I think that's a much more complex combination of the way in which they're dealing with the outside world and the fears on the inside. I think there is a genuine fear on the part of many within that leadership and portions of the elite that support them that Russia is a very fragile enterprise at this point, could easily come apart, that what happened to the Soviet Union could happen to Russia. And in this context, I think they do a number of things that probably, in the end, are capable of producing self-fulfilling prophecy rather than solving the problem. But I think it helps to explain the impulse. On the U.S. side, I'd finish briefly by saying, I think in many ways we are where we are because we spent 20 years not thinking seriously about Russia, not taking Russia seriously. So it was very easy, once Russia became a pain in the ass, to treat it the way we're treating it. Once it was back on its feet and troublesome, not having thought about it in its weakness, not having recognized the stake that we had in the relationship, once they come back and they come back for the worse, I think it ends up in this disdainful fashion. One of the wise statements was, and I stop with this, was Henry Kissinger in the Washington Post when everybody was trying to figure out what the Ukrainian crisis was all about, the way we were reacting, whether it was late night television or Hillary Clinton or John McCain or others commenting on Putin in the way they've commented on him. The demonization of Putin is not a policy, it's an alibi for the absence of a policy.
The most important part of the book, obviously, it seems to me, is your where to section, or what is to be done, I suppose would be another way of putting it. You list 3 necessary things that must happen to get us out of this impasse. The first is the emergence on both sides of a clearer sense of why it matters, why it's important for the US and Russia to reintegrate their approach to current challenges, including the crisis in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. And then you went to say to contemplate what part it played in producing the train wreck. That's getting back to this question of each side blaming the other. And then the third point you make is each government needs to plan policy within a wider compass rather than confining policy to the day's immediate problems defined in narrow terms and addressed tactically. Russia and the United States need to set these problems in the larger context of where they want the US relationship to be several years down the road. I mean, that's eminent good sense. How optimistic are you of this coming to pass?
Let me be clear about one thing. I have no difficulty assigning blame at certain critical points. We went over the cliff in the context of the Ukrainian crisis, and we went over the cliff, in my view, because of what Russia did in Crimea and then set out to do also in Donbass. But one then has to understand how that came about, and that was a product of a dance we did together for 20 years. That's not to justify what he did or their side, the Russian side, and when I say what he did, it was his decision in the case of Crimea, the annexation, or the little green men. But it comes to the first major point for this book. On both sides, including much of Europe, within the policy community, within the parliaments, within the media, within much of the expert community, the preoccupation is with the challenge posed by the other side, the problem the other side represents to them. And there's virtually no thinking about the relationship itself, where we are, and what its consequences are. Now, it's very important to deal with the short-term problems, what's going on, what Russia may do from their point of view, what the US, NATO, and others may do in a Ukrainian context, or in Syria, or over INF, an arms control treaty that's under enormous pressure. You don't ignore that. But in order to get at that problem in a way that doesn't destroy the future, I'm arguing for what is a very difficult analytical and policy planning challenge or chore. That is, how do you develop policy in dealing with Ukraine, if you're in Washington, or any of the other problems, in a way that doesn't destroy the relationship you want to have with Russia and that you need to have if you properly understand the larger stakes 10 years from now. They have to do the same thing. It has to be reciprocal. One side does it alone, it fails. It goes no place. But you can't begin to do that unless you start by saying, where do we want, in realistic terms, not as a pie in the sky, where do you want this relationship to be 10 years from now in realistic terms? You don't do that, you don't invest in that, and you don't think about it wisely unless you come back and you ask, what are the stakes in this relationship? And that's something that neither the Russian nor the American leadership, from Bush Sr. through Clinton, through Bush Jr., to even the Obama administration, let alone Yeltsin and Putin on their side, have thought about sufficiently. What are the stakes? In a realistic way, short term and longer run. Then you come back to this question of, okay, Ukraine's a real problem, Syria's a problem, INF is a serious problem, you can list some other things. How do you deal with that optimally in a way that doesn't destroy where you want this relation to be in the longer run? We don't do any of that right now. We are simply responding tactically to the immediate set of problems. When I say we, I mean Moscow, I mean Washington, I mean Berlin, I mean Brussels. The immediate set of problems and trying to make some headway. By the way, I didn't answer your question as how hopeful are you, and that can be in a sentence. And I've spoken to now a number of audiences in Europe and here, and I've learned to start by saying, if ever there was an idea whose time has not come, it's in this book. So I'm not optimistic anytime soon.
At the beginning of the talk, you characterized one of the points of difference of the current state of play as no nuclear tensions, and you added the word yet. We now have anti-ballistic missiles in place. Do you think this is a strategic challenge or threatens the balance? And then secondly, what would be the next couple of steps up a ladder of escalation that would most concern you?
On the nuclear issue, that does allow me to say a word about at least one of the very large stakes. I think there are 4 or 5 very large stakes that we have in the relationship. You can argue that Russia doesn't matter to us because it's got an economy 1/8 the size of ours and a defense budget 1/11 of ours. But that's the wrong metric. What country matters more than Russia, as Bill Burns said, to more aspects of U.S. foreign policy? China may be more important to us, and certainly over the longer run. But Russia, think about it, pick up your newspaper and the issues that we're worried about, whether it's Syria or whether it's Iranian nuclear weapons, never mind Ukraine or elsewhere. What other country is more important to us right now? And what's the reason for that? It's not what my political science colleagues in IR will tell you. It's what the real estate agent will tell you, the most important thing. What is it? Location, location, location. And Russia's right at the center of everything that matters to us in international politics, the Eurasian core. And therefore, one of the great stakes is, rather than feuding and failing to address the question of how both countries commit themselves to what I call, as part of this strategic vision, stable change and mutual security, and I emphasize mutual security in the Eurasian core, which in turn affects everything from the Korean Peninsula to the volatile South Asian picture between India and Pakistan, through Central Asia, to the Middle East and Syria as it radiates up into the Caucasus, to Ukraine, and then around to the Baltic. What's more important than promoting stable change and mutual security in and around the Eurasian core? And if you're going to do that, whom do you have to do it with? And whom do they have to do it with? Because that's their world. Now on the other issue, nuclear. David referred to something that I'm involved with now. We're just beginning it. It's a large project at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to think about how we deal with the new nuclear age, the challenge of the new nuclear age. This is a world that's multipolar nuclear. It has 9 nuclear powers. It's not the old world, even though the United States and Russia still have 92% of the weapons. But the other players no longer simply our allies, the British and the French, but the Chinese, the Indians and the Pakistanis. That world is getting geometrically ever more complex because there is now a very lively, important, and threatening dimension to the US-Russia relationship, already driven by the fact that both countries are modernizing their triads. We're going to spend $358 billion in the next 10 years modernizing the 3 legs of our nuclear triad. and more than $1 trillion over the next 3 decades in modernizing all aspects of our nuclear weapons program, and they're doing the same thing. There's a China dimension to the US-Russia nuclear relationship. India and Pakistan are both building new triads of their own. The Pakistanis have the most rapid development of short-range, including battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, and a theory that if India attacks again conventionally, where they have conventional superiority, and another Mumbai 2 terror attack, they will respond with battlefield nuclear weapons that will be delivered by a missile called the Nasser. India's only nuclear doctrine at this point is if any nuclear weapon is used against us, even if it's a battlefield tactical nuclear weapon, our response will be with massive retaliation, counter-value. That means cities and otherwise. The Chinese will soon, as they build their triad, have the largest set of SSBN, strategic submarine forces, in the Pacific, even as the Russians move theirs to the Pacific from the northern area. And that's only the beginning. I could give you 50 other points of why this is now a far more complex and indeed dangerous nuclear world than the original one. I think the chances in the next, not now, but in the next 10 to 15 years of a nuclear weapon being fired in anger are far greater now than they ever were during the Cold War, including Cuban Missile Crisis and Berlin crises. And the final point is not only is no one in either government or anywhere else even beginning to formulate this problem, but we are presiding over the liquidation, the disintegration of the patchwork system that we had in place before. ABM agreement is gone. INF agreement is under tension and pressure. Fissile material agreement has never been implemented because of veto. The Nunn-Lugar program the Russians pulled out from securing nuclear weapons last December. The conventional forces and European agreement adapted, never was put in place. It's lost in the idea of negotiating conventional arms control at a time when we're remilitarizing a new Central Front move to the east. Is gone. The only thing that remains at this point is the New START agreement. That expires 2020, and unlike every past agreement that we've signed since 1972, when the sides immediately begin thinking about follow-on, what we negotiate next, there isn't the beginning of any kind of a movement to do anything in that area. I think that's a very big stake in US-Russia relations, not in this case because of real estate, that is location, but because we've got 92% of the weapons together.
I was here last month speaking about sort of this larger growth of Russian imperialism coming back and using what you said before as the Cold War as this warring ideological systems and are going back to the 90s. I was wondering if that could apply to the 1890s and the 1900s and some of the work that Carnegie was doing, looking at the bookends of the Cold War being conflict in Serbia, conflict in the Middle East that led to Sykes-Picot, how much that the return to that mindset is fueling the modern conflict.
There is an element of that. There's a very interesting aspect about Putin's Russia these days that some of us began noticing a year ago. It was particularly at the time of the dedication of the World War I memorial in Moscow, where he delivered a speech in which he praised the imperial soldiers that fought that war, and then he attacked the Bolsheviks for everything that they gave away after they came to power. So there's an interesting thing that has further developed. Putin is a fan of Stalin, not because of the terror, but because of the strength of leadership. Putin is a critic of Lenin, doesn't like Lenin, and doesn't like Yeltsin, and doesn't like Gorbachev, and sees himself as somebody that will save Russia in the way in which strong Russian leaders in the past. And there are very serious friends of mine who argue there's a kind of megalomania now. It's a further source of the tension in dealing with Western leaders. He now sees himself historically in the same category with Peter or Ivan Grozny or other great Russian leaders that have been essential to save Russia, even though there are a lot of people on the outside would say, you know, what are the grounds for that? And then to sit down with Obama or to sit down with Angela Merkel, who then treat him as though he doesn't even have political legitimacy within his own society, really burns him, they would argue. That's secondary, so I don't want to stress that. I think the way in which he's thinking about Russia and Russian history, he is a reader of Russian history. He spends a lot of time reading Russian history. What he takes from it, what he understands, or what others around him take from it or understand, you'll notice that even Lavrov, who's sort of a quintessential professional foreign policy figure, leader, diplomat, lately, and the stuff that he's been doing has been justifying Russian foreign policy in the same context. So at least it's now in the Kool-Aid. But how profound it is, I don't know. It comes back to and is linked to this, if you will, clash of civilizations and the new notion that Russia represents a different set of social and political values in opposition to a desiccated Western set of values and so on. There is a serious discussion among us. How much of this is essentially instrumental that could be turned off tomorrow through the media? How much of it is in fact something that's real, that they're tapping? And even if they're not fully convinced themselves, how difficult it would be to reverse what they're tapping. I tend to believe that something is being created, and it's not going to, they couldn't turn it around tomorrow, in my view, in terms of the way I understand what's going on in Russia today. But whether they could in the longer run, then you have to come back to the other side of Russian history. I mean, what we're seeing now may be Eurasianism, it may be the modern extension of Pan-Slavism, but we've also got the Zapadniki, the Westernizers, and there's still a large component of that within Russia, including a fair portion of a business community, an intellectual community, and otherwise. So I don't know how it'll all play out in the long run. I think we have to be sensitive to these things. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience, your time, your questions.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.